The escalation of the war in Ukraine, with Russia's intervention in the conflict, has brought about a number of channels that are explicitly pro-Ukrainian. One of these channels, which has only recently gained popularity, is called History of Everything. This channel published its first video less than 1 year ago, which was titled, "Why the Russian Navy Sucks," a title he has since changed, probably to make it appear a little less like clickbait. This series is by far his most popular series, consistently receiving 6-figure views on each video over the course of 5 videos. The reason why this series is popular becomes self-evident upon watching the first video. It is wholly dedicated to bashing the Russian Navy, covering a number of incidents involving the Russian Navy and arguing that these incidents are symptomatic of the Russian Navy being terrible, if not having always been terrible. If I wanted to treat this like I'd do with Alton Shay's videos, I would run down all of these videos and discuss them point for point. However, most of the information he presents has been thoroughly discussed time and time again. The incidents he covers, such as the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the Kursk, and numerous other incidents of the Russian Navy, did occur, and the information he presents is not necessarily inaccurate. The problem with the videos becomes self-evident when you realize he makes no comparisons to other navies. It is strictly about showing off the incidents that occurred in the Russian Navy and using those incidents as a means of arguing how the Navy is terrible. This argument takes the Russian Navy and isolates it, placing it in a void in order to make it look terrible. This is inherently disingenuous, as a navy does not exist within a void. The entire purpose behind having a navy is to either facilitate the invasion of an overseas power or to defend against such an overseas power. A navy exists because it is a core component of the defense of a nation against rival powers. This necessitates the comparison of one navy to another navy in order to determine whether that navy is good or bad. For this, we will be examining some of the incidents he covers in his video series and comparing them with the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and a couple of other examples when applicable. First, let's summarize some of the incidents he covers in the first and second video of the series, and some of the information he, rather conveniently, left out. His first video focuses heavily on the 2nd Pacific Squadron, going into detail about its general incompetency and the incidents that occurred with it up until the final clash with the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima Strait. Now, what he neglects to mention in his summary is the entire reason why the Baltic Fleet was sent out in the first place. It was sent as a final gambit rather than as a willing choice. With the 1st Pacific Squadron suffering significant losses, including the loss of Admiral Makarov and being trapped in port, Tsar Nicholas II had to send some form of relief force. This left 2 options: the Black Sea Fleet and the Baltic Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet, the better experienced of the 2 fleets, was confined to the Black Sea and could not be sent out. This left the less experienced Baltic Fleet that could be dispatched. A number of these vessels were brand new vessels, with equally new and green sailors who hadn't been drilled before being sent out. The reason for the lack of experience comes down to all of the experienced naval crew either being confined to the Black Sea Fleet or to the Pacific Squadron, which was trapped in port. Additionally, the Baltic Fleet was often confined to port due to the ice buildup that plagued the ports along the Baltic coast, meaning they had less time to properly train. It is also worth noting here that the Japanese Navy wasn't some joke either, After the opening of the country to European powers in the mid-1850s, the Japanese had begun to rapidly industrialize and educated themselves in the newly formed Meiji military branches on Western schools of warfare. The Japanese were heavily influenced by the doctrines of the Royal Navy and had purchased battleships from British dockyards. The flagship of the Japanese fleet, the Mikasa, was one such example. Add on top of this the added advantage of fighting in their home waters and not having to sail over 18,000 miles around the world, and you can understand why the Japanese Navy was able to decisively defeat the 2nd Pacific Squadron. The entire reason for this incident is not due to incompetency with the Russian Navy. Rather, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was a last-ditch attempt to relieve the 1st Pacific Squadron and, hopefully, buy enough time for Russian reinforcements to arrive and relieve Port Arthur. Most of the incidents involving the 2nd Pacific Squadron were due to the lack of the training of the crew, a crew sent out before they could receive formal training. This is not because Russia wanted to do so or due to some incompetency of the governing body, but due to there being no other options at hand. The other major incident of note he discusses is the sinking of the Kursk. The general details he provides in the video are not inaccurate, as stated previously, though he does leave out a key bit of information. The Kursk incident occurred as a result of the economic and social collapse following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The main reason behind why the Kursk had suffered an explosion related to its torpedoes is due to the lack of funding available to maintain the infrastructure on the vessel and to maintain the training of the crew. This, again, I would not attribute to incompetency within the Russian Navy. Rather, it is due to the deterioration of the financial situation in the Russian Federation, issues that the Russian Federation has been addressing since 2000. In fact, many of the incidents involving the condition of Russian warships during this time boils down to the financial problems faced by the Russian Federation from 1991 until the early 2000s, including several other incidents he covers in later videos. There are also other minor factors he attributes to the perceived incompetency of the Russian Navy, such as the sinking of the Moskva in May 2022, the development of round Russian ironclads, and so on and so forth. Many of these smaller incidents are used to try to support the general point History of Everything is attempting to make, that the Russian Navy is incompetent because of all of these incidents that occurred. The problem with the argument being made is these incidents also occurred with other navies, just as regularly and often with spectacular results. It is here I wish to look away from his video and look towards History of Everything's favorite sacred cow, the Royal Navy. For those unaware, History of Everything is an Australian. This is something he doesn't keep secret. This helps to explain his fawning over the Royal Navy, a love he has expressed both on Twitter and in his video covering the Battle of Jutland. This video being no less biased against the Germans as his video on the Russians. The Royal Navy, to put it mildly, has had a long storied history of countless triumphs, such as the victories of Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson under its belt. However, just as with any navy, it has also suffered its fair share of failures, incompetency, and mismanagement. Take the battle that History of Everything rather one-sidedly covered, Jutland. For as much as he propagates the notion of it being a victory, the battle was marred with considerable incompetency, the most notable example being the performance of the battlecruiser fleet under the command of Admiral David Beatty. During the course of the first engagement, the Royal Navy suffered the loss of 3 of its 8 battlecruisers, roughly half of its total strength, in the engagement. The battlecruisers were torn asunder by violent explosions, sending them to the bottom of the North Sea. All the while, HMS Lion, Beatty's flagship, had suffered significant damage, resulting in a fire that nearly led to her falling for the same fate as HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary. The only thing that saved the battlecruiser fleet from near total destruction was Admiral John Jellicoe arriving with the Dreadnought fleet. It was the arrival of the Dreadnought fleet that prompted Admiral Reinhard Scheer and Admiral Franz Ritter von Hipper to withdraw, the withdrawal resulting in the loss of one of their 5 battlecruisers and one of their pre-Dreadnought battleships. In the end, the Royal Navy was battered and down 3 battlecruisers, while the High Seas Fleet, though they failed to break the blockade, was able to escape intact while inflicting far greater damage upon the Royal Navy than they received. After the battle, inquiries on what occurred were made concerning the fleet action and why the Royal Navy's battlecruiser force suffered their losses in such a catastrophic fashion. It was during these investigations that a notable and deadly breach in the safety regulations was done by the crew of these vessels. As a means of speeding up their fire rate, blast doors to the powder magazines were wedged open and safety mechanisms installed in order to prevent catastrophic detonations of the magazine were bypassed. To make matters worse, cordite had been stored in the hallways in between the magazine and the turrets, providing a chain for a fire to set off and reach the magazines, resulting in 3 of the Royal Navy's state-of-the-art battlecruisers to violently explode. These casualties, including the loss of 3 armored cruisers and 8 destroyers, killed over 6,000 men of the Royal Navy. To make matters worse, the battle did not change the course of the war. The blockade had been maintained, but the High Seas Fleet had escaped and prevented the Royal Navy from doing much else outside of maintain the blockade. This is often why historians conclude that the battle was inconclusive or an outright draw. Neither the High Seas Fleet nor the Royal Navy achieved their primary goals, with the Royal Navy showing itself worse for wear. This, of course, was not the only time the Royal Navy saw significant issues. In the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, we have the loss of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in December 1941. Due to a combination of the sudden nature of the Japanese's entry into the war and communications issues, the battleships had little air cover from the RAF in Singapore, resulting in both ships being swarmed by Japanese torpedo bombers and level bombers, getting hit by multiple torpedoes and sinking. If we go back in time to the War of 1812, the Royal Navy suffered a number of defeats against the U.S. Navy's exceptionally small naval force of up-gunned frigates such as USS Constitution, USS Chesapeake, and USS United States. The British would see a number of their vessels operating in American waters seized by the U.S. Navy, some of which saw the captains of these vessels play into every single strength of the U.S. frigates, as we see with HMS Macedonian. Moving away from this tragic subject, let us discuss British ironclad designs. If Russia is bad for having experimental round ironclad warships, then what is the Royal Navy for having HMS Captain? This ironclad, a civilian-designed proposal that was pushed through Parliament for construction, turned out to be a terribly designed warship. Unlike the round ironclads of the Black Sea Fleet, HMS Captain was remarkably unstable as a seagoing vessel. But Parliament pushed for its usage against the Royal Navy's best advice. As a result, HMS Captain would sink in a storm, taking with her the lives of over 400 men. If we were to follow history of everything's logic here, ignoring all of the achievements of the Royal Navy and examining their own failures, we could come out of it with the impression that the Royal Navy is about as incompetent as the Russian Navy. But wait, we could expand this even further. I've already discussed some of the successes of the United States Navy, but how about we get into some of their mishaps over the years, shall we? If it can be said that the Russian Navy is bad because of incidents of incompetency, then a brief overview of the incompetency of the United States Navy might make it look like the king's greatest fool. We can first see this incompetency, or supposed incompetency, with the entire handling of the United States Navy by the most helpful entity on the entire planet, the federal government. For much of its history, the United States Navy was severely underfunded to the degree that, during the end of the 19th century, there was a serious threat that the United States Navy would be rivaled by South American navies, as the U.S. Navy had consisted mostly of exceptionally outdated ironclads from the American Civil War, during a time when the European powers, including Russia, were developing and launching pre-dreadnought battleships. However, so as we don't get too caught up in the mess that is the federal bureaucracy doing what it does best, I think we should look at a few of the incidents that occurred during the American Civil War and some of the questionable decisions made by the Navy. First, if the Russian Navy was crazy for developing and deploying round ironclads, then this thing is the definition of insanity. The USS Monitor is, objectively speaking, a weird design with numerous flaws. First, the turret design, developed by John Erickson, was a complex design that, though it functioned well enough as a turret, had a few problems. Namely, changing the direction of the turret was difficult, often prompting the crew of the Monitor-class vessels to let the thing rotate a full 360 degrees rather than try to reverse its direction. This design could also turn out of control if the control mechanism for the turret malfunctioned or was damaged during combat. This, in fact, happened during the USS Monitor's engagement with CSS Virginia. Second, the ironclad had a fairly significant flaw. It sat low in the water. Very low. In fact, the freeboard of the USS Monitor, this being the height from the waterline up to the deck, sat between 1 to 2 feet. This rendered the vessel unfit for seagoing and could cause the ship to sink even in slightly rough weather conditions. In fact, the USS Monitor had nearly sunk on its voyage down to Hampton Roads when it encountered rough weather. However, it was on December 31st, 1862, that she and a number of her crew befell the terrible fate of being sunk during a terrible winter storm off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in a part of the sea that is literally known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. However, this design, a design that would go on to be widely reproduced with generally decent results, was not the only ironclad warship utilized by the Union in 1862. Another, more infamous ironclad came out of this period, which had been dubbed as one of the worst warships to have ever been designed and put to sea. The USS Galena. The Galena was one of 3 ironclads that were produced in late 1861 and early 1862, the other 2 being USS Monitor and USS New Ironsides. However, where the other 2 ironclads had considerable iron armor protection, Galena's armor scheme was questionable, at best. Her iron armor was roughly 1 inch thinner than her contemporaries, and when she was first presented to Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsborough, was described as a most miserable contrivance. In fact, according to Stephen W. Sears, Goldsboro refused to send her into combat before shields made out of boilerplates were installed to prevent nuts holding the iron plates to the wooden-hulled warship from popping out and potentially killing her crew. Even with these makeshift repairs, Goldsboro remarked, "She is a sad affair." It was this sad affair of an ironclad that would end up becoming infamous when, on May 15th, 1862, she, the Monitor, the Naugatuck, the Aroostook, and the Port Royal would steam up the James River in an attempt to bombard the city of Richmond. However, a formidable defensive work had been constructed on top of a bluff overlooking the James, specifically on the property of Augustus H. Drury, where 5 naval guns were trained down a mile-long section of the James River. The commander of the squadron, Commander John Rogers, would sail the Galena to within 600 yards of the naval fortress sitting atop the bluff. It was here that Galena's armor scheme would prove to be inadequate, as she'd take over 44 hits, many of which penetrated her hull, with one shot going through her armor and embedding itself on the opposite side of the ship, several shells exploding within the vessel, and the shells igniting a small fire. She was forced to pull back, with 14 of her crew dead and another 10 injured. This ironclad proved to be an unmitigated disaster for the United States Navy, seeing her iron armor stripped from her entirely. However, I believe we've discussed enough about ironclads. What other sort of incompetencies can be found with the United States Navy? Well, quite a bit. One particularly infamous example is that of the Honda Point disaster. This particular incident happened on the 8th of September, 1923, involving a large number of destroyers operating along the California coast. Due to the development of dense fog and an error on the part of the navigational crew, at least 7 destroyers of the United States Navy, the USS Delphi, USS Lee, USS Young, USS Woodbury, USS Nicholas, USS Fuller, and USS Chauncey, would run aground on the rocky shoals nearby Honda Point in Southern California. This disaster was a combination of poor weather conditions, poor navigation, and poor decision-making upon Commander Edward H. Watson. A board of inquiry investigated the incident and court-martialed all of the captains of the destroyers and Commander Watson, which found Watson guilty of negligence, with Watson taking responsibility for what happened. However, I wish to discuss 2 particular incidents of note as they rebuff one of the points brought up by History of Everything. In Part 2 of Why the Russian Navy Sucks, he discusses at length the events surrounding the sinking of the Kursk, which I've partly outlined earlier. As stated previously, History of Everything also has a tendency of taking such incidents and presenting them in a void, criticizing the Russian government for not accepting foreign assistance regarding the sunken sub, which might have saved lives. However, this is not the first time a navy kept a sinking of a nuclear submarine under wraps. In fact, on the opposite side of the recently ended Cold War, the United States covered their tracks regarding 2 incidents involving nuclear submarines, both of which happened within 5 years of one another. Those incidents: the sinking of the USS Scorpion and USS Thresher. The first of the 2 nuclear-powered submarines to sink was USS Thresher, which suffered an implosion after conducting diving tests on April 9, 1963. Due to a combination of poor welding of the body, lack of training of the crew, and a general overconfidence in the capabilities of the nuclear power plant aboard the Thresher, she would suffer an implosion at depth, resulting in her splitting up into 6 different pieces at the bottom of the Atlantic, roughly 220 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. The sinking would claim the lives of all 129 crewmen. Many of the documents concerning the investigation of the sinking were kept classified until 2020, nearly 57 years after she sank. In fact, there were still documents concerning her sinking that were being declassified as late as 2021. The USS Scorpion disaster, which likely occurred on May 21st, 1968, was just as deadly. The Scorpion had recently wrapped up its operations in the Mediterranean and had linked up with a small flotilla of U.S. submarines nearby the Canary Islands. Her last radio signal was sent out on May 21st, 1968. After that, she went completely silent. The Navy's hydrophone system, set up to detect Soviet submarines and warships, detected an underwater explosion, often associated with the implosion of a sinking vessel. The Navy launched a lengthy investigation, discovering the wreck and photographing it in detail. The Navy's prolonged investigation into the incident has never turned up an official cause, though, according to the documents released in the late 1990s, the most likely culprit was a failure in the safety mechanisms of the Scorpion combined with an explosion of the battery power cell system on board, causing significant flooding that led to her sinking below her crushed depth and imploding. Her sinking would claim the lives of 99 men, all of whom lie at the bottom of the ocean, though are not forgotten. In the end, her sinking was likely a culprit of the same mistakes that led to the sinking of the USS Thresher 5 years previously. Much like with the Thresher, most of the documents regarding her sinking were classified for decades and only began to turn up long after the end of the Cold War. If the Russian Navy can be called incompetent for not requesting aid and trying to keep the sinking of the Kursk under wraps, then it renders the U.S. Navy, for making a mistake, failing to learn from it, and resulting in a mistake just as terrible as the first, the epitome of incompetence. Or, maybe, the methods that are being used by History of Everything are wrong. This is where I take issue with the means by which he measures the competency of the Russian Navy. The extrapolation of these incidents as evidence of incompetency is a blatant form of sophistry. History of Everything has already reached his conclusion long before presenting these videos. He already believes Russia and Russians as a whole are incompetent. To support this, he takes these incidents concerning the Russian Navy and proceeds to extrapolate from them the conclusion he has already presumed from the beginning. This is why, when I first watched the video, I pointed out the significant flaw in his methodology and brought up a few examples concerning other navies. It was here that he rebutted the argument by labeling what I pointed out as a whataboutism, arguing that pointing out these other navies is deflecting from the incompetency of the Russian Navy. The insistence that we ought to compare one navy to another to determine whether or not a navy is incompetent is not a whataboutism. It's the logical course of any form of argument. In order to make a fair assessment on the capabilities of any person, we first need to establish a basis for determining the competency of a particular thing, whether it be a person, a nation, or in this case, a navy. This necessitates comparisons with other navies in order to understand whether an incident is purely an outlier or if it is an observable trend between other navies. As I have demonstrated here, many of the points that History of Everything brought up are points that could be brought up with any and every other navy. All of these navies share the same scenarios. All of them have moments of extreme incompetency or failures that often prove catastrophic. To parody Syndrome from The Incredibles, if every navy is incompetent, then no one is. These examples cannot be taken as examples of incompetency as they are all exemplified in other navies, meaning that it would render every navy, including nations with truly powerful navies, as being incompetent. This metric does not work. This begs the question, why then does History of Everything use this as the basis of its argument? Well, unfortunately, I've come to a rather dour conclusion. History of Everything hates Russia. Dare I say he even hates the Russian people. Much like with Laserpig, Anarchy History, P-Run, and every other channel that has gained shocking amounts of popularity over the past couple of years, History of Everything has gained his viewership by plying his avocation for Ukraine. He is, in the most crude sense of the term, a harlot for the prostitution ring I affectionately refer to as the shill for Ukraine grift. He, much like with the rest of the people I listed, are dirty, sleazy folk who gained their influence by bashing the Russians as being almost subhuman. In fact, many of his followers believe Russians are subhuman. In a bitter twist of irony, adopting the ideological beliefs of the very ideology the ancestors of the modern Russian Federation forces fought against. The ideology he often claims to reject. To make matters worse, History of Everything's videos have been a rabbit hole for me. They have exposed the deep underlying cesspool of the internet. His fan base, including his greatest admirers, engage in some of the most disgusting, repulsive behavior I have ever had the misfortune to witness. To conclude, this series History of Everything has produced is nothing more than sophistry, which exists purely to cater to an audience that deeply despises the Russian people. It only affirms their biases concerning the inferiority of the Russian people, a bias that has been shown time and again to be misplaced. I have not made this video to sway any of the fans of this channel. I have made this video as a warning. My warning is this: do not engage with this channel. It is better to not watch these videos, to deliberately block yourself from seeing them on your timeline. The best way to undermine these propagandists, these handlers of wickedness, is to not engage with their content and inadvertently promote it. If you wish to learn about naval history, particularly from a source that tries his best to not let his biases blind him, I would recommend watching Draconofel's content. Much of the information for this video was sourced from his videos, which have proven to be some of the most well-researched videos concerning naval warfare on YouTube. In the meantime, I will pray for these people to turn away from their wicked deeds for their salvation. But, most important of all, I just want to wish this: may God bless all of us.